Hi, guys. First of all, I just want to personally thank Patrick for his contribution to CF. I have 2 cousins with cystic fibrosis, but I am going to talk to some extent about the positives of a community because I think they're just as real as the negatives, and I contend just as important. So a few years ago, I opened what I call an art-centric lifestyle boutique. Shortly thereafter, I started hosting an event in my community which highlights local designers, musicians, and independent caterers. Since then, people have been coming to me seeking advice on how they too can open their own business or start their own creative endeavor. And I always find this request just a little bit troubling, not because I don't want to help, quite the opposite, but because implicit in this question is first that I have an answer, and second, that because I've done those things, it might be a good one, perhaps the magic solution that they need to fulfill their dreams. So I can't very well say to them, I don't know, I just sort of did it. But that is kind of how I felt about it. My life has always sort of felt like a natural progression. So how do I apply that to help others? So I thought a lot about it, and I think a more important question really ought to be, how does one arrive at doing something? Because when you have, and you've gotten to the point of having a passionate commitment for something, the steps and the details in facilitating that endeavor will always find a way to work themselves out. You just make it happen. So my question then becomes, how can I teach a passionate commitment? And to attempt to answer that, I'm going to share my story on how I developed a passionate commitment for my business and my community. So we're going to have to go back in time a little bit to tell that story, to a time when I was young and awkward and had no idea where my life was going. See, when I was little, I thought I had no talents. I looked to my 2 older brothers who were effortlessly good at everything they did, and I never seemed to stack up. However, I was the youngest, so perhaps I just hadn't reached the enlightened ages of 8 and 10, as they clearly had. But the problem was that I did equate my destiny with a talent. And so I needed to get to that talent to know where the heck I was headed. So my attempt was then to try everything until one stuck. So I did. Amongst the things I tried were musical instruments, choir, theater, ballet, gymnastics, swimming, softball, skiing, track, basketball, oil painting, photography, writing. And to be fair, I was good at some. Like, I'm certain no one here would ever guess, particularly the ones that know me, except for my parents who can vouch for this, no one here would ever guess in a million years that I was super awesome at basketball. It's totally true. In 7th grade, I started on the 8th grade team, top rebounder, MVP. But this isn't what I wanted to be good at. If I was to be following my own logic, was I to believe I had a career as a basketball superstar in my future? Perhaps join the WBA? Does that even exist anymore? No, it does? I'm sorry. But see, this is how up on basketball I am. So no, I was going to have to figure out a new approach to determining my path. So instead of focusing on all that I couldn't do or what may or may not come, I started paying close attention to how I felt about everything I tried, everything I did, even everything I read and saw, which helped me develop a really good sense of intuition and instincts, which at the very least allowed me to employ a process of elimination approach. For example, I really like being super awesome at basketball, but I don't so much care for being sweaty in a weird polyester uniform. So we'll just cross that off the list, just like that. Even better than the process of elimination approach was the statistic that I read sometime in my early 20s that stated that American adults had on average 7 careers in their lifetime. Not jobs, but careers. So I could just go out to LA, try the whole film career thing out, and if it doesn't pan out, no biggie. I've got like 5 or 6 other careers I have to get to. So I did it. I went out to LA and went to work in the film industry. I had no idea how to do it, but I did have a passionate commitment that propelled me 3,000 miles across the country to do it. So started with non-paying jobs, free work, free labor. But those jobs led to paying jobs working in set design, wardrobe departments, and prop shopping on music videos, television commercials, independent films. But when an impending writer's strike struck and the work started to dry up, I didn't freak out. Instead, I tried something else that I really enjoyed and ended up working as a stylist in photo shoots and then for an interior designer who owned her own retail store, which led to a career in visual merchandising and buying for stores big and small in LA and Cleveland. I worked as a merchandiser for a mid-century modern furniture store in LA to a visual manager doing store openings across the country for Anthropologie, all the while taking each opportunity, giving it 150% as if it were my life calling, and passionately immersing myself in each endeavor, which always just led naturally to the next, because it was no longer about this destination or where all this path was going to lead to. It was about what am I enjoying about what I'm doing right now. What is it about this experience that is motivating and propelling me? And in many cases, my next role or my next job was one that I made up or created that didn't exist before, just simply out of a desire to do that thing. Now, this story leads almost right up into the point where I opened my store. The difference in time between where this part of the story leaves off and the next chapter begins is only a matter of 2 months, which is notable because then you can see that I had never set out to open a store. In fact, I had never even thought of it until my path led me on a camping trip with friends. And one of those friends posed the fateful question, why don't you open your own store? And this is where I have my own hiccup in this process because my reaction to that was, because that's crazy and I don't have the resources to open my own store. But the question did continue to nag at me. And I thought about it. I let my intuition take me along a path that revealed my talents. It didn't start with my talents. It started with me paying attention to how I felt about everything I tried, and it just evolved and led me down a path which I was honoring. So I was doing things I liked, therefore I was doing things I was passionate about, and therefore this question of succeeding was no longer relevant because I already had. So when I go back to that question of opening my store and I look back on my initial reaction of, yeah, that's cool, but I can't do that, I realize that lots of us do this. This is a knee-jerk reaction to a big idea oftentimes. I mean, how many times, oh boy, how many times have you or someone you know been sitting around and you think of this really great idea and you get super excited about that idea, you know, and you may banter about it, visualize the idea, and there's all this positive energy going around thinking about this cool idea. And in more cases than not, what follows all this excitement and positive energy is this. Yeah, that's a really cool idea. Man, someone should totally do that. What is that? Well, I decided this time that that someone would in fact be me. And within 1 month of that camping trip, I quit my very good, very reliable, financially stabilizing, creative job and dove headfirst into an abyss of the unknown. What caused me to initially find that idea to be crazy, and what prevents a lot of people from pursuing their dreams, is the fear in the unknowns. But when you live passionately, it is you knowing yourself and you believing in yourself. And in that case, there are no longer any unknowns that matter. How can it not succeed when you are passionately doing something that is 100% you? So I did it. I'm now the shopkeeper in a store in a neighborhood that I was now assimilating into. And the perspective that I gained from my new role awakened me to a correlation I had never considered before. I was realizing that with each new person I met at my shop, my views of my city grew incrementally. With each new person, my view and my opinion of the city in general, of its opportunities, its accessibility, its viability, and its cachet grew incrementally with each new person that I met. And that spurred on this new passion for people and thus my community. To speak to this new passion about people and community and people and opportunities, I'm going to share a few quick stories. Last year, before taking myself to Paris, NPR had a story about an American expat named Jim Haynes. He'd been living in Paris for 30 years, and every single Sunday for the last 28 of those years, He hosted a dinner party in his home for strangers, 60 strangers. Now, initially, it was all word of mouth how you got in on these dinners, but with the internet, I immediately shot this man an email explaining to him, I'm a lifelong Francophile, I've never been to Paris before, I'm going alone, my last night of the trip happens to be on a Sunday, and pretty much short of threatening to throw myself in the Seine if I did not get on that list, I was able to get an invitation to this dinner. When I showed up, it was really remarkable because Jim Haynes greeted me very cheerfully himself. And he asked for my name, and I said Danielle DeBoe. And without ever breaking eye contact or referencing the list he was in fact holding, he said, shopkeeper from Ohio? Wow, this was going to be interesting. So he said, go on in, make yourself completely at home. Upon entering, I was struck by two things. One, it seemed like far more than 60 people. And two, it was far tinier a home than I had anticipated. So this would in fact be an intimate evening. But because the nature of the evening was about strangers getting together, inhibitions just disappeared and everyone was engaging effortlessly. At one point, Jim Haynes grabs my arm and the arm of the first person to walk by and said, Daisy, Danielle, Danielle, Daisy. He made connections like that all night long. It was incredible. I met a woman from Hong Kong who was in town for the fashion collections, a young model from Germany in town for the same reason, a student from Iowa, a woman from the New York Times, a couple of Aussies, as usual, they're everywhere, and a young Russian family. The husband only gets 1 week off a year, and he took his wife and 3-year-old daughter on a trip. They're in the top corner. The little 3-year-old was running around between everyone's legs all night. It was just a really amazing evening. I met these two utterly charming, older, like in their 60s, late 60s, bohemian Frenchmen, Claude and Michel. It was just a really remarkable evening. And I thought about it at some point, because of course I was the last person to leave. I couldn't tear myself away from Jim Haynes. He was so fascinating to me. As I was sitting there talking to him, I realized that this cool idea of having this dinner party for strangers had to start with him sitting around, possibly even with Claude and Michel, saying, wouldn't it be cool to have a dinner party with like a bunch of strangers? Like, what would that be like? And you know what? He did it. And he continued to do it every week for 28 years, making countless connections and contributing to making the world just a little bit smaller. And how could we all not benefit from the world and our communities being just a little bit smaller? Wouldn't that make life and opportunities in our communities just a little bit greater? Now take that experience and marry it to one I had while I was on a buying trip in New York last month. So here I am walking down Soho in the middle of an afternoon, the wide sidewalks crammed with people, something many of us desire. I myself feel the energy that comes from a crowded street. But this time, while cutting through the crowds, I started to take mental note of the aesthetic similarities between myself and some of these people, indicators to me that we have shared interests perhaps, common, some of these people might also be interested in art and design or music and fashion, travel and politics. But even with this potential common denominator, at the same time I realized there was no connection. Nobody was connecting. And it struck me with a sudden pang of ironic loneliness. And I started to continue walking, but imagine them all just sort of disappearing one by one until I was alone again. And I realized, what use is it to be engulfed in throngs of people if there's no connection to it, no soul to it? I might as well just be walking down that wide sidewalk all alone. Imagine being back in my neighborhood, walking into my local coffee shop where I'm greeted by name by Nikki or Brian or Susan or any number of patrons. And I walk back out onto the street and look across. Oh, look, there's Joy or John from the Gordon Square. Turn a corner, perhaps neighborhood residents Dave and Patty walking their dog. This neighborhood, a neighborhood to me worth living in and operating a business out of, is a neighborhood that marries the small town to the urban living experience. And this is far more valuable to my mind than walking down a crowded street of strangers who can't meet my eyes. My passions and my instincts led me to opening room service, but they're no longer confined to the 650 square feet of that store. I realized what makes me happy is not only doing something that I am passionate about and that I love, but by doing so in the context of a community that feeds my soul. that my role as a business owner is not all business. It is really about honoring the historic role of the mom and pop shop that serves to bring together a community and add vibrancy to a neighborhood. My final thought is this. The only thing extraordinary about people who turn their desires into a reality is that they are simply ordinary people living presently and passionately. And instead of saying, that's a really cool idea, someone should totally do that, they change one word and thus their lives. That's a really cool idea. I am totally going to do that. Thank you.